I am a 51-year-old Chinese-American transgender woman who was born in Pennsylvania, but moved to Arizona in my 20s and lived there for 5 years, moving back east after these experiences. I don't believe in the paranormal or magic or even ghosts, but after living in Arizona, I do believe in skinwalkers. I don't know if one was following me or if I just happened to be unlucky enough to encounter multiple of them. I just know that weird things happened, and skinwalkers were all I could find that made sense. And I know that I will never set foot in Arizona again. I am not a Native American, so I don't know if skinwalker is even truly the right thing I've encountered. But anyone who has different ideas, please let me know. First encounter. This was the first week that I lived in Santa Cruz County. I rented a small house for my first place. I would come to move a lot, actually. Nobody here knew anything about me. For all they knew, I was just a normal girl with no secrets. I have had a great deal of work done. Yes, including SRS, but I have been told it looks very natural, except for my lips, which are very distinctly misshapen from some blotched lip fillers I had in the past. Nobody I met in Arizona knew I was transgender at the time. I do not speak to my traditional Chinese parents anymore, and have not seen them since I was 15. My sister came to visit me frequently though. One night at my house, my sister had come over and we were talking on the porch as she was smoking a cigarette. She had talked to me about her father wanting to see pictures of me and how she had refused. He does not accept my transition, and while he is on good terms with her, she refuses to share my life with him since he does not want to be a part of it anyway. However, sometimes he makes attempts. She was mocking his voice to try and make me laugh, repeating in Mandarin what essentially translated to, "I want to see his picture," while pointing to me. It was something he did every single time he called me a man, even in casual conversations, as if that could convince me that I was a man. We laughed about it and continued talking. After she left my house to head to the airport, it was starting to get dark when I heard knocking on the back door to the porch. My sister was there even after leaving only 2 hours ago. Without her car in front, by the way. She was holding a pack of Marlboros with a cigarette in her mouth, just standing at the door. My sister is known to only smoke Camels. I opened it up, but I stood inside, assuming she obviously would come in, but she stood there. We made eye contact and I got goosebumps for unknown reasons. She looked tired in a way that I hadn't seen since she first had my nephew. She said in Chinese, "I want to see his picture," and pointed to me. Her verse was slurred, like she was drunk. When I looked at her hand, just because when someone gestures I tend to follow it, I noticed her feet were horribly disfigured. She repeated the Mandarin again, but this time her words were wrong. Like how when you are teaching an English speaker how to say something, and they repeat it with stress on the incorrect sounds. I felt very confused, but after an evening of drinking, note that at this time in my life I was not yet an alcoholic. I was only a casual drinker who could get tipsy off just 1 or 2 drinks. I became an alcoholic after the encounters had started, but I am over 20 years sober. I honestly assumed I was just having a weird dream. It felt like real life, and I had been watching TV before the knock, but the way her feet looked, I knew it wasn't real. I closed the door and walked back to bed. I woke up in my clothes and hairstyle from the night before, which is very unusual for me. I make it a point to braid my hair before bed and to change into one of my silk night dresses. Immediately, a chill ran up my spine, and I quickly called my sister, who had gotten an earlier flight home because the pilot of her original flight had become ill, and they had a whole ordeal at the airport of people switching flights and tickets with the airline or other passengers. She had my nephew's baseball game that next day, so a woman exchanged her ticket for my sister's for the next day. Instead of waiting at the airport, she actually got on a plane an hour early than her original. I had not fallen asleep after she left, and it was clear I only had gone to bed after closing the door. As a non-believer, but someone who enjoys listening to scary stories on the radio or television, I was creeped out, but figured I had to have been seeing things because she was definitely not at my house. I made a habit of locking the porch door, and it actually inspired me to stop smoking cigarettes myself. A few years later, when I became aware that it was a skinwalker, I could no longer think of smoking the same way. I did not quit cold turkey. Second encounter. I was out drinking all night at a bar, and had originally planned for only another drink or two before my friend would come and pick me up to drive me home. But this very handsome man named David sat down and started hitting on me. He was very charming and funny. I had a very good time. He asked if I would go home to sleep with him, and I politely declined because I'm not that kind of girl. Being someone who is transgender and prefers to stay private about that, even after SRS, I still make sure to disclose my birth sex to any man I'm dating or sleeping with. Only knowing him for a few hours, especially as I was drunk, and I didn't know his opinion on transgenders, of course I wasn't going to tell him. He said he understood and asked me if I felt comfortable with his friend, who was a waitress at the bar, driving me home. I said sure and called my friend, saying I wouldn't need a ride. We drank and talked, and the woman was done with her shift. He walked me to the door and kissed my hand, asking me to call him later for another date. I felt like a princess that night and slept like a baby. I didn't call him that day because I was going to go by the 3-day rule. I don't know if girls these days still do it, but when I was a young sprout, we would wait 3 days before calling back a suitor with the idea of leaving him waiting for you to call, so he will be excited to hear from you. Anyway, that whole day I was thinking about him. He was definitely a dreamboat. That night at 6 p.m. I heard pounding on the door. It was David. He was just standing there with a facial expression that seemed like he was on drugs, beating in the door with both fists with no car in the driveway or out front. I was scared that it was because I hadn't called him back immediately, so I called the police, and as soon as I started talking on the phone, his head turned sharply. It looked like it hurt. He looked me in the eyes from the window, never stopping the slamming, and for some reason, all I can think of was my sister a few months prior, and I felt goosebumps again. I also thought his nose looked different than when I sat one bar stool away from him. But then again, I was really drunk when I saw him, so maybe I was wrong. It looked much bigger than I remembered, and it was really red and swollen, with a trail of blood coming from both nostrils. But the blood looked weird too. I can't explain how it looked weird, but above my door had a light that I turned on to see who it was, and under the light, it didn't shine red. I told the police that a man I met at a bar last night was violently knocking on my door in a way that seemed like he wanted to hurt me. They said a cop was coming and to stay on the line. I asked how long it would take, and he, the skinwalker I thought was David, closed his eyes, like squeezing them shut. I will never forget the way his hands immediately froze mid-motion, hovering in front of the door, just about to hit it. All of a sudden, he turned around and walked away, just walking in a straight line down the street. He wasn't in a hurry, and he walked with a limp. I didn't notice that at the bar. It was like he heard that the police were coming and decided to give up. I told the person on the phone and stayed on the line, hiding in my kitchen until the officer arrived. He looked annoyed and said if David came back to call again. I did not file a police report against him. The officer asked, and I did not want to because I was scared that he would find out and come back. I just wanted it to be all over. I have PTSD from being beaten by men for being transgender when I was younger before. 1 week later, I saw David again walking in town, and he smiled at me, walking over to say hello, with a happy expression on his face. He looked how I remembered him from the bar, not from my house, but I was still scared. I started crying and I told him to stay away from me, very loudly, and he looked confused and hurt, but he apologized and walked away quickly, no limp. He was a polite person at the bar and out in the town. Even just him saying my name, I felt the same way I did in the bar, and if it had not been for the way what I now think was a skinwalker had behaved at my house, I would have gladly talked to him. After I found out about skinwalkers, I wanted to call his phone number, even if it was crazy, but I wanted to explain why I screamed at him the day we met in town. Even after screaming at him all those years ago, and sometimes still now, I get the feeling that he truly was the one who got away. After seeing David again, I was worried he would come back to the house. At this point, I wouldn't let him learn about skinwalkers for another few weeks, so I decided I should get a dog. My landlord said he wouldn't allow one, so I waited until I moved houses. I moved to Pima County, not far from Tucson. I adopted a pit bull because, even though I don't believe the stereotypes about them, I hoped David would if he ever came around again. His name was Fang, but I called him Fango Mango for the first few days I had him, just as a silly nickname, and eventually I changed his name to just Mango because he was the sweetest dog ever and he started responding to it over Fang. He was abused by his previous owners and was part of a dog fighting company as a puppy. He had a giant part of his left ear missing. Even seeing himself in a mirror made him scared. He was scared of other dogs and of men. He made me feel a lot safer and happier. One night he wanted to go out to go pee, so I let him out while I got myself a cup of water. All of a sudden I heard growling and whimpering, like he saw another dog and was scared it would attack him. I go to look out the window, and he was whimpering in the middle of the yard, and the other dog was out of the view of the window. I had heard how he cries around the other dog before, and it sounded different this time, so I thought he might have been hurt. Usually when he got scared, he would close his eyes with his paws, but in the yard his eyes were open, looking at the door, and his head was up, not wherever this other dog was. I ran to the door and opened it, calling his name, and he started running at me. All of a sudden, Mango ran into my legs while I was watching him running, still 10 to 15 feet from the door. I slammed it shut on impulse, not even processing what was happening. And then, the dog that had been running actually ran headfirst into the door. Mango stood in front of me, between me and the door, growling. I had never heard him growl before. I ran to the window, but he stood at the door scratching at it, like he wanted to get out and kill the other dog. He scratched so hard that it actually left marks in the door. The other dog turned and ran away when I noticed something crazy. The piece of missing ear was now on the right, not the left, and his tail looked like it was stung by tons of bees. That next day, I went to the supermarket and bought a steak for Mango as a reward for being my fierce protector from the other dog. I've been a vegetarian since I was 12, so I pretty much cooked it to hell and back, but when I gave him the cut up pieces, he didn't seem to mind the burnt parts. The other dog had scratched the door too, but his claw marks looked nowhere similar to the ones inside that the real Mango had made. My landlord made me pay for a new door, which was fine by me. I eventually moved because he would make crude comments about me. Fourth encounter. This is the first encounter that actually made me feel like there was a connection to the previous events. The blank and unexpressive eyes. The weird way the one that spoke, the one who whimpered, sounds so real at first, but when I listened again, they came out wrong in a way. The weird differences. Up to this point, the feet, the nose, and the ear and tail, and the fact that they were all around the same window of time at night. Anyway, this time I was taking Mango for a walk in the evening, and even though it was light outside, it got dark pretty quickly. I still lived in the county I was, and only a few streets away from my old place. This new house didn't have a yard, so I walked him multiple times per day, every day. He was a pretty old dog when I got him. At this time, he would have been around 11. I heard my name being called by my neighbor or so I turned to see where she was to say hello. She sounded like she had a lisp when she pronounces the S, which she normally didn't have, but I couldn't see her. From the same direction, out of the bushes, a desert coyote bolted at me. Mango jumped in front of me and growled, grabbing it by its body and its mouth and slamming it to the ground. He had never growled around me before, the time where the Skinwalker looked like him, and up until this point, it was still the only time he had growled. It wiggled out of his teeth and there was no blood on it. The fur was barely even disturbed. Its muzzle looked too big for its face, like someone had drawn it out of proportion. The tail was bent weird as hell, almost like it had been broken in multiple places. It clearly wasn't an animal in its right mind because, instead of running away, it immediately turned back and attacked Mango. I tried to pull the coyote off of him. The coyote fell cold to the touch, despite the warm night, and it bit me on the arm, very deeply. I still have the faint scar to this day. The pain was like nothing I have ever felt. It felt like my entire arm was on fire, and the actual bite mark was visually pulsing. Even after being viciously attacked and actively being attacked, Mango still continued to try and fight off the coyote. I felt like I was going to pass out. I was so nauseous, and I fell to the ground because everything was spinning, but willed myself to stay awake to help my dog. Mango bit the coyote on the face or the neck, and it screamed like a human man would, not like any of the injured coyote noises I have ever heard online. It ran away and I watched it. Before it left, it turned around and stared at me in the eyes, and showed me its teeth in a way that it looked like it was smiling at me. Once again, it felt like all those other times and my skin crawled. I picked Mango up in my arms and cried over him. Even in his pain, he licked my face. His beautiful gingerbread fur was soaked in blood and coyote bites, and he not only threw up onto me, but he just started pooping and peeing all over, uncontrollably, because he started having seizures. By the time animal control had come with an emergency vet, he died. I went to the hospital because of my bite, and I had to get 13 stitches. In the hospital waiting room, I actually had my first seizure ever. I had them extremely often the rest of the time I lived in Arizona, and I haven't had a single one since I left, and never went back. The wound didn't heal for weeks and got infected multiple times. The coyote was not rabid because neither of us had any evidence of rabies or other illnesses that coyotes carry. Losing Mango sent me into a deep depression, and I went to a therapist to deal with the grief. She had me involuntarily hospitalized, where I was diagnosed with PTSD, as well as a schizophrenic because I told them all about the encounters and said the coyotes was a demon who was trying to make me suffer. After living in this psychiatric ward for nearly 2 months, I was discharged and I got a tattoo of mango fruit to cover the coyote bite scar. Not many people that I knew, especially women, had tattoos, but I was proud of it. The day my friend came to pick me up from the hospital, we saw a coyote alone. I called the landlord when I was hospitalized, and after I got out, he actually helped me and my friends move all of my stuff. I never went back and even left the county. I was not a religious woman by any means, but the only thing I could think of at the time was that a demon was tormenting me. I should also mention that a man who I was dating at the time found a heavily mutilated and half-decayed coyote corpse in the front of his apartment one month into my stay at the hospital, And he broke up with me over the phone because he thought if I was crazy enough to be in a mental hospital, my friends were probably crazy enough to do something like that to him, and he made a lot of bad remarks about me trying to turn him gay. Fifth encounter. I had moved to a town between Florence and Globe and just wanted to start over. I was having really bad side effects from the medicine, but my outpatient psychiatrist said to not stop taking it. This was 3 months after leaving the hospital that my tattoo bite area started to feel like it was burning. Not all the time, but sometimes. Usually at night and almost always before I had a seizure. This is another strange thing that happened the rest of the time that I lived in Arizona that also hasn't happened since I moved away. In my new apartment, I had a cat named Slinky. One day, Slinky went missing while I was at work, and I started asking around if anyone had seen her, because I lived on the 4th floor and never let her out. So even if she left my apartment, someone had to take her somewhere to not be on the floor. One of my neighbors told me that she helped my boyfriend take her as per my request, and she looked horrified that I asked her if she saw my missing cat. I didn't even have a boyfriend and clearly didn't have my non-existent boyfriend go take her so I could ask her to describe him. She said a Native American or possibly Mexican man saw her in the hallway and walked up to her with an empty cat carrier and asked if she could call the building manager for him because I asked him to take Slinky to the vet for me, but he forgot his key. Coincidentally, or maybe he knew this, she was the neighbor I had started to become good friends with, and she made my spare key. She let him in, but he got a call on his phone before he went in. He asked her to get Slinky for him, claiming that Slinky was scared of him and went into the stairwell to talk on the phone. Once my neighbor had put Slinky in the carrier, the man left. That night, my bite burned so bad I had a seizure in my bed. When I checked the mail the following day, I had an envelope with just my first name written on it, and nothing else. The only thing that was inside was Slinky's fur, as if someone had used electric hair clippers to shave it off. I felt like a paranoid racist, but I went to the library to research Native American curses and weird experiences, eventually coming across skinwalkers. A few days later at work, I saw a cat in the parking lot next to my car that looked exactly like Slinky, besides the weird shaped tail, and obviously if it was Slinky, her hair would be all shaved off. But it wasn't. It started walking towards me, but I got in my car and tried to run it over. Not something I'm proud of, even if it was a skinwalker. I swerved at the last second because I couldn't bring myself to actually kill it. I can't say if this is an encounter for sure, but a few days after this, a large hawk was pecking at my window for over 2 hours and only left after it started raining. I say I don't know because I didn't see anything weird about it. Slinky was the last pet that I owned. The last encounter. I was living in Bylis when a woman grabbed my arm. The one I was bit on. While walking down the street, actually. She looked like she had a stroke or something because half of her face had been drooping very, very noticeably. She had the same blank eyes I now associated with what I assumed were skinwalkers. Gave me the same goosebumps too. My skin was in searing pain, where she was holding me, and in a voice that sounded almost like a messed up recording, she said my birth name. I pulled away and my skin was red, in the shape of her hand. I asked her why she was tormenting me for all of these years, and she just repeated the name my parents gave me at birth. This time, with a last name that I also had changed and not told anyone. This woman had found my old real name. Even after disclosing I am transgender and I never ever give out my old real name, let alone the entirety of it. I told her to just kill me and get it over with, because by this point, I didn't want to live with the fear and paranoia and suffering anymore. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but nothing came out when she moved her lips. I ran towards my car and drove away. I decided that day I needed to move before I was killed by this thing. So my sister flew out to get me, and I packed everything up to move in with her for just a few months on the East Coast. She sat outside of the Safford Regional Airport while she was smoking. She saw a woman who looked exactly like me, besides her lips, and she looked like she was wearing men's clothes. Everything else exactly the same. I believe it wanted to kill my sister. I stopped taking medication a few years later. After it was confirmed I was misdiagnosed as a schizophrenic, they put a sticky note in my file at my therapist's office that the reason for hospitalization was a psychosis episode that was mistaken for schizophrenia. This is what my therapist said she would do. I genuinely believe I had a skinwalker tormenting me, if not the same one, then a group of them. I have a fear of animals and am very prone to staring new people I meet in the eyes, in case they might be a skinwalker. I don't go out at night, and for a few years, I became a severe alcoholic. I now have liver cancer, but my wonderful man has supported me in sobriety and treatment. He doesn't care that I might be cursed by evil creatures, because he loves me, but every day I live in paranoia that one day the skinwalker will decide to leave Arizona to come find me and kill him, or our teenage adopted daughters. I also believe the only reason I was not killed is because it had some intent to harass me, and that by saying I wanted to die, I would be the winner if it had killed me. I think the natives have been here long before us, and they know the kind of evil this country holds in its bones. I hope that even if you kind people cannot offer me a possible explanation for what has happened in my past, you can at least find entertainment in what I've told you. Sometimes I find it ironic that, despite not believing in ghosts, some of my favorite ghost stories are the ones that claim to be real events. I would appreciate any information anyone could give me, as well as anyone who might know why it targeted me. Thank you for everyone to take the time to listen to this.